Thanks everybody for coming. Today's topic is adopting cloud infrastructure with the FileMaker Platform. And I know it may not be everybody's cup of tea or everybody's kind of area of experience, but probably if you've been around developing enough, you've dealt with infrastructure and planning out FileMaker deployments. So this should be at least on your radar, I would think. A little bit about me, and Phil kind of covered all this, so we can skip most of this. I do have certifications as a AWS Solutions Architect, also various FileMaker certifications, different versions there. So the big question is like, why FileMaker in the cloud? Why go down this road at all? Well, a couple of reasons. One is expanding on your existing skill sets. So, like I said, if you've been around for a while in doing FileMaker, you've probably had to plan out deployments. So you're already familiar with concepts such as network architecture and performance across at least like the local area network. But it also gives you a chance to start that from scratch, to rethink that whole architecture. There's also an expanding market opportunity, right? And of course, now with the pandemic going on, there's an increasing interest in moving to the cloud or expanding into it. And that kind of leads into this last point of ease of entry. How especially with services like AWS, where you can pay on demand, you can kind of dip your toes in the pool before jumping in all the way. You can try a little bit and only pay for a small amount, test out the waters before you really decide to go all in. So an interesting figure I wanted to bring up was the total IT spend. So as an industry, like their total IT expenditures, 97% of the total IT spend is still on-prem, which leaves 3% for cloud expenditures. So as big as AWS and Azure and everything is, it still only represents 3% of the total IT spend across the board. So it's still early days for cloud adoption. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here, a lot of room for growth. So special considerations specific to FileMaker. Right, of course, you've got your application-specific considerations, right? And you've probably looked into these already. Optimizing for performance across the WAN, especially if you've got an existing FileMaker solution that has been around for years. That maybe it's started in version 6 or 7. It has kind of come along the way, and now they're looking at expanding that, moving it to the cloud. So there's probably a lot of detritus in there and room for optimization, cleaning up layouts. There's a lot out there. FileMaker or Claris now just put out a couple blog posts about optimizing for a wide area network. And there may be opportunities for rewriting certain parts of your solution, working around some limitations that you run into. An example might be, complex reports that need to be rewritten to run on server side instead of in the client. And that can be that can make a huge difference. That's a lot of times where FileMaker developers kind of end in their thinking, but there's a whole lot of other considerations, infrastructure considerations, where you're developing your network architecture. And we're going to have a slide about this, kind of demonstrating that a little bit more in depth. There's this notion of your network architecture being programmable, right? So it's on-demand network architecture. So that could be in a certain region, having built out your entire LAN architecture, how you structure your subnets, how you architect your security between those. If you need to support more than one region, how those connect together, a lot of that. And that's all, instead of, in the old days where you have to purchase that network gear, set it all up, configure it, and know how it all operates together. At least now it's all virtual where you can build those things out. Another big point is your DR strategy, DR standing for disaster recovery. And, this is a point that gets often overlooked. Even if you've got a FileMaker server and have scheduled backups and think you're all set, that's a good way to go. But, usually it's, what do they say? You want at least 3 backups. Shut these off. So your backups would be, you'd at least have 1 set of backups. And then depending on how many different copies you want, at least on that server, you need to have the hard drive space to take that, to be able to hold all that. And depending on your solution, that can be an issue, because when you move to the cloud, hard drive space isn't as inexpensive, or it's not a one-time purchase where you're paying for that space. So there are different strategies to consider there. And of course, security, you always want at the very least, like encryption in transit, setting up SSL, making that work properly, and of course, any other considerations around security. And then something that may not come on most people's radar is the notion of DevOps or even SysOps. There's a little bit difference between the two. Where you get into DevOps is where you maybe have a team of developers under you, and you need to think about how you're going to provide access to the resources that those developers need. Versus SysOps, where it's more about maintaining the operations of those systems, making sure that they're up, as well as how are you going to be monitoring those resources, and making sure they're up. If there's something down, you get the proper people get notified, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's cost considerations. And I want to introduce the idea of CapEx versus OpEx. CapEx meaning capital expenditure. So typically, capital expenditure relates more to fixed costs. So in your on-prem architecture, you would be looking at capital expenditure, purchasing equipment, setting it up, versus operation expenditure or OpEx, where these are more your on-demand flexible costs. So moving to the cloud, you're looking at more OpEx versus CapEx. It's just a little bit in switch in overall thinking. That can throw some people where it's like, hey, what's my cost? Okay, well, I can give you an estimate. We can do some, estimating out what those operational expenses are going to be without, a fixed capital expenditure cost. So communicating that can sometimes go a long way to helping your constituents buy into cloud migrations. And then, of course, tracking those costs and calculating your overall return on investment, or ROI. So these are all like above and beyond just developing for your FileMaker application. There's all these other considerations to have kind of in your mind. So just to kind of explain like what we went through when we were building our FileMaker hosting service and planning out that service, this was really driven a lot by our previous experience with other FileMaker hosting out there. And this was a couple versions ago, admittedly, but the landscape really wasn't that great. And part of it was due to providers trying to get as many clients on one machine as they could. So you might have 100 different files all belonging to different people, all kind of sharing the same resources. So I really like the licensing that they put in place, because there was really no way to silo like a FileMaker server per client. So now you've kind of got that, where each individual client has their own server, and that makes a whole lot of sense, because there's really no good way to isolate, especially with server-side scripting and things of that nature, server-side plugins and stuff, to allocate those towards one client without affecting every other file on that server. So we kind of took a look at that, and we wanted to provide a better service for our clients, having gone through the pain of working with some different ones, and damaging relationships with our clients directly. We thought we could provide a better service. So we looked at building that to provide that for our clients. So in deciding like on the technical architecture of what this would be, this is kind of something that has evolved. So that's another kind of advantage working in cloud architecture in AWS. It is an evolving process that we continually improve on and make better. You can kind of see in the screenshot here, this is a screenshot of our administration database, where we can get like up-to-date costs of what infrastructure is going to be costing per individual machine out there, based on how we tag those resources. And we get that back in a report and can parse through it. And of course, there's a client-facing, like a web portal, where they can get access to that same kind of thing. And like this screenshot is showing how you would access backups, and we'll go into that in just a bit. So I kind of went into this notion of rethinking and innovating. Most people, when you are planning out going from an on-prem to cloud, it's not necessarily what they call lift and shift. Sometimes that applies, but a lot of times it's more than that. It's more than you can maybe get a lot of optimization by rethinking your architecture, taking advantage of what's available in cloud, and maybe put a little time into rewriting some of your methods that you use on-prem, and taking advantage of the cost savings that you get in some of those. So I've got a case study of backups, where traditionally we've got backups that, like in FileMaker Server, you can schedule a backup. What happens is it pauses the database, and then it has to write everything on that volume, right? It has to make a physical copy to another volume, or even the same volume, right? So you've got a little bit of downtime, and you may have seen the coffee cup pop up, and this is especially common on like large solutions. So if your solution's 8 gig, not counting the external container data, like you're going to be waiting for however long the operating system and the volumes can write out 8 gig. So SSDs really help that along, but it's still a process and still consumes cycles, right? So we looked at options of utilizing snapshots in AWS to write that data out to S3, right? You also have the option where you could write those out individually to an S3 bucket, and that works pretty good. You still have the compute cycles where it takes time to write those out to an S3 bucket, and we found that especially in cases where there was a lot of external container data, because that can really stack up over time, that it would still do that sync out, but then dealing with those thousands and thousands of objects potentially in S3 to be a little burdensome. So we looked at just snapshotting the entire volume. right? And some of the technical challenges involved with that was database compatibility. So if you just issue a snapshot of a volume with open databases, you know that in FileMaker, that's not really something you want to do. You want to be able to pause the databases first, then do your snapshot, then resume all databases. And then making those available, right? You've got these snapshots out there, sitting out there. How do you make them available without, manually going out and dealing with that? So to go a little bit more in depth in this kind of place too, thinking about a DR strategy that's going to work for, most of the clients. There's still other options, but we figured like this is a really good option for most people, right? Where we can have a dynamically defined retention policy and keep them client accessible. So you can see on this screenshot where we can define, and this is showing our default setup, how we've got a rolling snapshot every 24 hours, once an hour. So at the top of the hour, it takes a snapshot. And this all happens like really fast. Users don't even know that this happens. So when you issue a pause in FileMaker Server, it's only paused for a second while the snapshot command gets issued. Once that snapshot command is issued, it can resume immediately. There's no time where it has to wait for files to write out. It's essentially a virtual drive in the cloud. So it's taking a snapshot in an instant. So even if we've got one solution that's 500 gig, that happens in an instant. And just to keep 24 backups of 500 gig, I mean, you could do the math. That's going to add up and be pretty cost prohibitive if you want to keep space, volume space for that, and to pay for it. So we feel like this is a really good option, especially for bigger solutions and even for smaller solutions, to have that many backups, right? It's rolling 24-hour window, and then once a day, we keep 7 of those. So at the end of the day, we'll keep a backup for that, and then out of those, we'll keep up to 4 per week, and then monthly going on, we'll retain 3, and we can adjust those. Say if you want, I'd like to have a backup going 6 months back. We just set that number up to 6, and that'll all automatically kind of be taken care of. So what happens when a client needs to access something on that snapshot, right? Say I want something from yesterday. I go and click on the snapshot to request that. What happens is out in AWS, that particular snapshot is accessed, and there's a new volume created based on that snapshot. This happens pretty quick too. Even on large volume, we found that creating a snapshot or a volume from a snapshot happens pretty quick. And then of course we'll tag it, because that allows us to do our cost allocation. Like we know the costs associated with this new volume coming on belong to this particular instance. And then we attach that to the volume. Then from within OS, we need to bring that volume online, assign it a drive letter, as well as set up a virtual IP or virtual FTP folder for it. And if you use an FTP client, so you will see it show up in your via FTP, and be able to download any of those files that you would need to, right? And then the reverse process, when you're done with it, you go click a button to take it offline. It kind of goes in reverse, tears all that stuff down, detaches the volume from the instance, deletes the volume. So you only pay for the costs associated for having that volume up, down to the minute in AWS of how long that volume was physically out there and available. And then once we delete it, you don't pay for it anymore. So it's extremely cost effective too. So first of all, any questions so far? All good? No? So we're looking to, yeah.
Save to.
Snapshots are actually in AWS. They show up as part of the like organized under the volumes, but instead of storing as EBS, which is elastic block storage, the snapshots are actually stored as S3. So the cost difference between S3 and EBS is pretty huge. So yeah, it's a lot more efficient to store them as snapshots rather than EBS. Does that answer it?
David, Sully, does that answer your question?
You don't see them like in an S3 bucket, but they're stored as S3, but they show up under EBS.
Okay. Sense. Yep, that answers it. He asked if we use Glacier at all.
We don't really. We see most of the cost savings in just this standard tier of S3. But with snapshots, there's no really, like, they're stored as S3, but you don't get like the option to switch the that storage tier with snapshots. They just kind of are what they are. Another nice thing I think I'll mention about snapshots is you know how in if you're doing external container data in FileMaker, how it will kind of manage the in the backups, it'll use hard links. So if you've got a large amount of external container data, you're not necessarily having a complete separate distinct copy of that every time. It's just kind of managing the delta between the difference of what the snapshot was or what the backups were last time. So snapshots work kind of like that, except they work on a block by block level for the entire volume. So the difference between one snapshot and the other, say you have a 20 gig volume, but only, it's only that whatever changed on the volume since the last time you snapshotted it. So the first time you snapshot the volume, it'll be 20 gig. Whatever happens in the database, say, you're making some changes and, to bring a new import and stuff. It's only those what changed they got written to the volume. It's the difference in the next snapshot. So the next snapshot won't be 20 gig. It'll be just whatever changed. There's some magic that happens on the AWS side where they manage that. I'm not exactly sure how they manage that, but that is pretty cool. Because even if you delete the first one, then that second one is no longer, it still represents that entire 20 gig volume. So that's something to kind of get just kind of built in when you use some snapshots.
And it's the whole volume, right? It's not just the databases. You're snapshotting the whole volume.
The entire volume.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, it's like a virtual snapshot. Like at a point in time, it can take more time to write out that snapshot and before it becomes available in AWS. Especially like the first time on a big volume, you'll see that. But the actual volume is up and available, immediately. It just does that snapshot does the eventual write. So you don't care about, it can take time to write that out, but you can continue using your volume.
Okay, thanks.
So I had mentioned like the idea of evolving architecture, and one of the ways that we're looking at doing that is we've gone into is the idea of managing multiple AWS accounts, and this has gotten a lot easier than it used to be. They've added a whole whole area they're calling organizations, where you can manage multiple accounts, and you only have to get manage that from one bill. So it's consolidated billing across all your managed accounts, right? And that's transparent to anybody else. So even if you're working in a large organization, you may want to do this to manage services available in particular accounts. We kind of use it to especially for managing costs, because there are certain costs in AWS that you can't necessarily tag. So we know by creating these, what we call tier accounts, that anything associated with that account belongs to that client. So an example might be sending email, right? There's no way to send an email and have that individual email tagged. So then tracking the cost between that becomes a challenge. So this makes it real easy for all those different services, especially the ones that you can't tag for cost allocation. That's a big reason for us why we did that. There are some other reasons to do it. One was economies of scale. So once you get into enough infrastructure, you're going to look at purchasing either reserved instances, or they introduce savings plans. So that's where we kind of know that these servers are going to be up and running 24/7 for 365, right? So why not? Basically, a reserved instance is you're just agreeing to use that sized instance for a certain amount of time, and then you get a nice little cost savings. There's some different options there, but even just jumping into the first level, you get immediately a 30% cost savings on the actual compute instance. You're still going to be paying the same for volumes and other things, but the lion's share of that is the EC2 cost anyway. So when you say purchase reserved instances, say you need 20 of them, that's going to apply across all your managed accounts with consolidated billing. So that's kind of nice. We also use it too for doing, say, A/B testing across accounts. So maybe we have a account that is entirely production. We don't necessarily want to do some testing and things in there. We can have an account entirely devoted to dev and QA, where we can test things out, make sure they work before then deploying to a production account. Something we've been working on more recently, this idea of a white label program. And we're kind of thinking about it for FBAs, but not just FBAs, but anybody that wants to use that as a partnership opportunity to, you want to rebrand what we have built and kind of work together to be able to do all of this and just rebrand it as your own. So, expanding into multiple accounts allows us to do that. So you have a custom name with a custom SSL certificate, and that needs to deploy automatically. We've kind of built the infrastructure to handle all that as well. So one case study I wanted to kind of show, because I think it's one of the more interesting ones that we've done here recently. We had a client, and they've got kind of a long-time client where they've got an on-prem FileMaker server. They're doing external authentication, right? Think about an Active Directory that also users authenticate to, a bunch of different services in their organization, not just FileMaker, but FileMaker was one of them. And so they wanted to expand and move on-prem. right? So they're getting rid of their FileMaker server, and they came to us to move to the cloud. So we worked with them to build out a site-to-site VPN, right? This client's great. He had a lot of networking knowledge, so working with him was pretty easy to get a VPN router on their side configured with AWS, a site-to-site VPN setup. And then we built up an Active Directory server in the cloud and enabled a two-way trust with their on-prem server, moved their FileMaker server up where we can take advantage of doing snapbacks. And he's also got some S3 integration working and stuff. And his on-prem clients didn't even need to know about it, right? They just authenticate the same way. They use a new address to get to the FileMaker server, but all their authentication actually comes from their on-prem Active Directory server. So when they do, employee onboarding, offboarding, that all happens through their AD. That just flows straight through to our FileMaker server in the cloud. So that was pretty neat. Then they're expanding too, right? They had another location that had some acquisitions. Now they've got another client location. And, initially it was the same thing. They could just see the FileMaker server in the cloud. But we ran into this case where they say, okay, what if some networking goes down? We've got an AD backup at the second location. We want to add a second site-to-site and then have the configure that. So if site 1 goes down, their second client location will pick up the Active Directory authentication from that. So there's kind of an extra layer of redundancy. It's kind of neat. And then they, as they add locations, they've kind of already got some redundancy built up in their AD and stuff. So they can always authenticate to FileMaker server. Any questions?
What about the data transfer costs from AWS? I'm not sure exactly what he means, but maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, there are data transfer costs. Going up into AWS, it's all free. There's no cost for transferring in. You only get expense when it comes down, but they're actually pretty minimal. We've kind of done some looked at that. Like we've got one client that their solution's around 8 gig, and we automated. They have a like a backup that runs on the instance, so we could script an FTP download daily to their on-prem server, right? So they're FTPing 8 gig every day. I think the estimated cost for that was around $18 in data transfer.
$18 per month? Is that
right? Yeah, per month.
Okay.
For 8 gig transfer a day.
Which is
so that's not bad. And the way we do billing is we just pass those costs on without marking them up.
Okay, thanks. That's it for now.
So now the idea of we talked about like all these technology perspectives, but when you're planning on a cloud migration, there may be other perspectives to take into consideration as well. Right, technology is often a minor part of cloud migration project. You've got project management, communicating with different stakeholders, and creating a plan. Right, that it was Eisenhower said this: that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And it's something that I've heard our CEO repeat occasionally. So that's important. And I don't want to underscore, or I don't want to leave out, project management. Project management discipline is a must, right? Don't underestimate this. This should be part of the process, and where you can include project management time in your estimating for the overall time. right? Follow good project management practices. So whatever methodology you're following, find a good one and stick to it, right? And invest in good project management tools. I know there's a lot out there, Basecamp, Atlassian, there's a bunch out there. So they're well worth the time and investment to use those. I also want to bring up, there is this idea of a cloud adoption framework, or CAF. And this is something that it's not AWS specific, but AWS does have a cloud adoption framework out there. There's a whole site exploring, like delving more into these ideas and give you, what an action plan is and how to create it. And there's some others out there available too. So this isn't unique to AWS. And it's about defining the business and technical requirements, right, and identifying potential issues in where those intersect, and to really get buy-in from all the different stakeholders involved. Right, kind of your job in doing that is to be a boundary spanner. You may be the one with the technical experience, but you also kind of have some experience in these others, so you can kind of be that bridge that gap between people that are maybe a little hesitant or skeptical, right, in working with these new architectures and methodologies. So helps to use this as a tool to set expectations for everybody involved. And I like to point out this well-architected framework, right? It's a set of questions to evaluate if a solution is aligned with established best practices. And it's based on 5 pillars, right? Operational excellence, security, reliability, performance efficiency, and cost optimization. So, this is a set of white papers out there available, and I just think it's a really good read, even if you're not involved in architecture or anything. I think a lot of this applies even just to building a FileMaker solution. You can think about, have these things in your mind, as you plan a solution out from top to bottom. And there's a URL for that. I think I hit on this a little bit before about keeping in mind, like thinking about opportunities for innovation, about rethinking what you're doing, and maybe looking at some different processes that you can use that may work better. This is kind of a fast evolving landscape, so there's new things introduced all the time. There's new services and things that come online that, okay, hey, that's new. We may be able to take advantage of that. What are the impacts of like moving to that, or what advantages do we get? So that's kind of changing all the time. And then kind of embracing these cloud capabilities, right? It really helps to follow some best practices, based on some of the earlier stuff that we talked about, like the well-architected framework, right? There's a lot in there that if you follow, even as these new services and things come out, if you follow best practices, they're going to be easier to adopt or easier to take advantage of. And I mentioned this, that it's always improving. I will note that it is kind of interesting that a lot of AWS architecture, they've taken some of the heavy lifting out, and made design choices on their end as far as architecture, for building this really global network. That it just makes it easy to build on. So like the difference between using, say, a 50 gig switch instead of like two 30 gig switches. It's like just the tiny details, and they get some cost savings by, making decisions to go one way or another. How, if you were building it out on-prem, it might be a different set of considerations, but how they can do some of that and, run their own cables and their own connections between regions, say, right? It makes it easy to build on. So I've used this graph to illustrate the difference in like a traditional cost expenditure. Now, if you look at the blue line, that's your if you needed to have an on-prem server, right? You need to have that initial cost expenditure, purchase equipment, rack and stack it, set up all your networking, and as your demand increases, right? That's the red line. If demand goes beyond your capacity, you've got that, additional capital expenditure, the time to order, get that all set up, hope that you receive your shipments and everything before your demand overruns your expenditure. So the green line kind of represents this idea of elasticity, right? And that's the E in EC2, how you can scale the machine up and down. So as your demand goes up, you can scale up and down to meet that demand. All right, I've got a couple demos planned here. Sure.
Address the fears of clients who are afraid of hacking. Because it's not on premise anymore, it's out in the cloud.
Yeah, we control, we don't just give anybody like remote desktop. So all the connections have to be secure, like all the FileMaker and web traffic is all SSL. It's all secure. So, and we do have a process of keeping these updated and patched regularly. So as much as FileMaker will let us, I think we've architected it pretty good.
What about the machines themselves? Like how vulnerable is the cloud to being hacked?
I mean, there are things that you can put in place, right? You can so that it's not just all wide open, right? A lot of it is how you define your security groups, not to allow traffic from just anywhere. You can allow it just from specific sources. You could even go so far as to build your networking such that it wouldn't necessarily be open. Like you could use what they call a bastion host or a jump box to then be able to get access to those machines. And that's some of the stuff that we'll do too. So that stuff isn't just out there in the open. You have to first, connect to a certain machine and then use that as your jumping off point to manage your machines from there.
Okay. We have a few other questions that have come in.
Okay.
Do you leave port 80 closed?
No, on our machines, like in general, 80's open. 80, 443, and 5003, and 16,000.
Those are the ports FileMaker has to have open, right?
Yeah, unless we need to, there's a reason to shut those down. But just as like a general, just in general, those are open.
Okay. Jonathan asked, is the main benefit of snapshotting the entire instance versus individual backups to reduce the number of S3 requests? You meant individual FileMaker backups. Or is it the space or is it the time?
Yeah, it is. It is. Mostly it's the time. Secondly, is the amount of backups that allows us to have at extremely low cost. there wouldn't be any S3 requests necessarily, because even though they're stored at S3 prices, they kind of show up under Elastic Block Storage. So there wouldn't be any S3 requests for it.
Okay, I think that gets confusing for some of us.
Yeah.
And then Mark had a longer question. I'm almost wondering if I should let Mark ask this himself. So I don't know if you can see the chat. So what he wrote was, one of my clients has tens of thousands of pictures on an image server. Pics are uploaded from technicians in the field to the image server and are viewed in FileMaker and also printed on invoices. And the users need to be able to copy pictures from the image server to their own desktop for various reasons. Like, what are some things that would you encounter trying to move something like that to the cloud?
Well, that may actually be pertinent to this first demo that I was going to show. I was going to show an S3 integration. I mean, there would be some, well, let me just jump into this and
Okay.
here we go here.
All right, and Mark, if you have more questions, why don't you ask them after this?
So this file I built is like a little demo file just to demonstrate integrating with an S3 bucket, right? So I've got an S3 bucket out there, and it has these objects in it. You can kind of think of S3 as like a giant database where it only has two fields, right? The key and the value. The key being the name of the object or the complete like URL for the object, and the value being the data that's in it. So typically we'd think of these as like kind of analogous to a container field. So I'm looking at a specific bucket. I'm listing out all the objects in that bucket. And this is all done with the AWS REST API. So we don't need any plugins or anything to do this. So I want to look at this particular object, right? Even though I've got this, I've kind of got it cached in a container field here. See if I delete this out of the container field. Right, that's gone. If I want to, I know that it's out there in S3. If I want to get that, I can bring that object down, put it in an S3 bucket or in a container field, and then kind of use this to like push stuff back up. So I can put an object up in a bucket, get it back down. I can delete the object. What might be relevant to Mark's question is I can create, if I know everything about this and I've got credentials, I can generate what's called a pre-signed URL, right? And this is going to expire with the number of seconds that I define here. So up to a week, I can generate a URL. And so this URL, you won't need to log in or anything. It can be entirely secure. Your bucket doesn't need to be open, but you can generate a URL that's only going to last for a certain amount of time, or only be good for a certain amount of time to access the object with their credentials that you provide. So the credentials aren't in here. It uses your credentials to create a signature that will work. Does that make sense?
A project I had to do where I had to make a nightly export, and I made the export in FileMaker, and then I used this to put it in the company's S3 bucket. They're like, we want this export put there. So I use this and it works great. It's been running flawlessly for like 4 months now. Every night, runs at 7 o'clock, and
Yeah,
it works really well. That's to put something in the bucket, but I can also go back and look at stuff that's in the bucket to download them and take a look at them individually to see what went in there. And then I've used it for the images, like you were saying, and this is more from what Mark was saying. Mark was asking, where you can put your images in S3 and use a lot less space, and you can load them as URLs instead of trying to load the images data.
right.
You can load it from the pre-signed URL. You just go and immediately make up the pre-signed URL and load it from there. So they just say in the S3 bucket.
Yeah, and we've done a few projects like this, so it's kind of nice that it decouples that container data from your database storage. it doesn't, you don't take up space on your FileMaker server storing all those objects. And these pre-signed URLs are nice too to generate these, and you can use a web viewer a lot of times, depending on what the object is, of course, to view that in a web viewer. So this is kind of nice. I'd actually like more time to develop this, because I think it really just scratches the surface of what you can do with S3. Like, you can enable server-side encryption on that object. So, for any reason, if somebody was able to get access to it, say another user that might have been inadvertent access to that bucket in your AWS account, you can have server-side encryption enabled on that object. That's layer protection. You can also change the storage class of that object, right? S3 that kind of includes Glacier, which was mentioned before.
Do you want to explain that? Do you want to explain the difference between this, like Glacier and Standard, for people who might not know?
So Standard is that's kind of your base level, and then like the next one down would be Standard infrequent access. So there's a big cost difference between these different tiers, right? Infrequent access means that, okay, you've got an object out there, but maybe you don't need to access it all the time. Maybe you just need, it's always going to be available. It's going to be there, but you get charged for every time that you download that object then. But you don't need to download it that much, so there can be a substantial cost saving, especially with a lot of objects. Some of these others are more geared towards if you're using this for web development, but like that Glacier one that was mentioned. So that is, you get a huge cost savings, but the kicker is you don't get immediate access to that object. So it's not on demand. You need to request access to that object. And with Glacier, you could be, waiting for a couple hours for that object to then become available again. But it's kind of meant for, we need to keep these objects around, maybe for years at a time. So we really need to optimize the cost in that. So does that kind of answer that question?
Sully says Glacier uses tape drives, but generally cheaper and it's slower, right?
That's why it takes, like a couple hours. It's got to, load up that set, get it, read it off of that, make it available again for you to be able to access it. But it's like fractions of a penny to store stuff on Glacier. So.
Okay.
So the other, let's see. Let's try and reload this. Yeah, while that's going. I also wanted to demonstrate this idea of VDI, or virtual desktop infrastructure. So there's a couple different options available. Need to reconnect here too. Fun. In AWS, at least, you have these two different offerings, workspaces and AppStream. They're both similar, a little bit different. Basically, it's kind of like your own little virtual machine kind of out there in the cloud, and there's different ways to configure this, but these are especially nice. We've had a couple people do this to get quicker access. So maybe they have a FileMaker solution that doesn't perform well over the WAN, right? It's really not geared, or maybe there's certain aspects of it that viewing images or something that are going to be slow regardless. So it's more cost effective and more performant to set up one of these workspaces in the cloud, where now instead of going from your client to to your FileMaker server in the cloud, that the FileMaker is basically it. For all intents and purposes, it's on the same LAN as your FileMaker server. So if I get FileMaker to start. So I already had this going, but so you can see the speed difference between there and necessarily my client. There's not going to be any network latency between this virtual machine in the cloud versus my client. See if this other one, this other one's actually going again too. So this is AppStream. It's kind of similar. It's more like if anybody has ever set up like a Citrix farm, where it's the same idea that you've got an actual workspace up there that users are accessing, but say you only want to expose one application without giving people access to the entire an entire Windows desktop, right? You could just have that one there. So if I wanted to same kind of thing, but it's the interesting thing here is I don't get access to the Windows desktop, and it's all running in a web browser, right? So this kind of goes in line with the that zero config deployment, whereas this Workspaces, it used a dedicated Workspaces app, and you install that app, and then you access your resources in the cloud. So either one of these is kind of an interesting option. We've kind of done these with different clients depending on their needs. It's kind of nice too, I think, because all your intellectual property, everything, like it's a way that now you don't have FileMaker databases going out on people's laptops. They just have this app or web browser to access what they need to. Any questions on that? Okay. Do it on time. Still okay?
So you're just over an hour. So if you've got more, you can keep going, or we can just open up for questions.
Yeah, the only other thing I had was an HTML demo that uses SES is a Amazon service, simple email service. So this was kind of a, see if I can find, this is in 19 because it required 19. It's just something I was putting together, and it sends through, so I can set it to use SMTP. Even with SMTP, I can send through that SES service, but because it offers an SMTP endpoint to send through. But it also offers, if I just want to send using the REST API instead of SMTP, I can avoid all that overhead associated with SMTP, like opening an SMTP connection and handshaking with the server and all that, sending your email through. And I can just send with a REST API, and I can build, some nice looking, HTML. I can even format it and whatnot. I want to make it bold. I want to make it green, right? And save that. And it's kind of cool with 19. It makes it real easy to do that. Say I want to add an attachment. Add some kind of pre-canned attachments here. I want to use this guy. I'll just drag and drop it in, and then this is going to send that up via our REST API, right? To send that, and then I get some JSON back from SES, giving me a an ID that it was sent. So. And SES for email is like, it's dirt cheap. See, there's my test with attachment. So that was my last demo. Going over to you, questions?
About this.
Open discussion.
Except my ability to use private chat seems to be in question. But besides SES and SMTP security, Jeff just asked that. I'm not sure what. Do you know what he's asking? SES and SMTP security. I'm going to go ahead and turn people's microphones on, and we can talk about this.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and enable microphones. Some people can't wait. But you guys can use or not use them as you see fit. Okay, Sully, you're on. Wait, who had the question, Jeff?
Yeah,
Jeff, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, go ahead.
You might be muted.
I can kind of try to answer anyway. There's
okay.
Oh, is that him?
This is Mark. Can you guys hear me speaking? Hello.
There you are, Mark. I see you.
Mark.
I see you and I hear you.
Cool. Some light on the subject. Yeah, you can hear me too?
Yep.
Cool. So, Mike, thanks for the demo. Cool stuff. I don't have anything going on with cloud at all, and was reluctant to move to it. Because most of my clients do this image stuff, a lot of images, and one in particular I was wondering about is how. So when you have this S3 bucket, when you look at these in FileMaker, is that a container field pointing to the bucket, or is it a web viewer, or either way? How does that work?
Either way, in this example file, this is a container field. So this is where we downloaded it, kind of on demand from that S3 bucket to show it in a container field. So this could even be like a global container field if you want to look at it that way. We've also done it with generating pre-signed URLs to view those in web viewers as well.
So I don't want to take a lot of time on this to get too specific, but take this use case where a technician goes in the field, takes 50 pictures of a job site, and when we print that invoice, users select maybe 30 of those pictures, and they all get printed on a separate page as thumbnails as backup to the job. So here's everything that this guy did on this job when he was there. Is that something that could happen in this? Clearly, you can't use a web viewer for that.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't want to use a web viewer, especially because web viewers don't print so well in Windows.
Right.
That's still around, but
at all.
Yeah,
right.
You could pull them down into container fields, and I've thought about that, and it's like I don't know if you're really paying too much of a penalty on that, because it's like even if they're on a FileMaker server, you're going to have to be transferring that data anyway. in some ways it may be faster to, because it wouldn't be all the data transfer coming from a FileMaker server. It could be, your FileMaker application served from FileMaker server, but your, essentially container data on S3 coming, served up from S3.
So
Mark.
one more quick. So for this, it's feasible that I could be sitting on a job order, looking at a portal into related images or pictures or whatever, most of the pictures, all the pictures taken on this job, and scroll through a portal of pictures in real time.
Mark,
Or
what I would do is, there's this file that he's showing you, this AWS REST API has a whole bunch of scripting in it that handles uploading the images, so it gets them into S3 to start with. And I think as you do that, I would make like another table that would have like low-res thumbnails of the images. So those would be in FileMaker and container fields. So when you're going through portals or lists, you would see the low-res thumbnail, something small, 100 by 100, 200 by 200 pixel image. And those would be what you would print. So most of the time when you're, printing or looking at them, scrolling lists, you would be looking at these thumbnails. And then if somebody wants to see details, they would pull up a web viewer that would have point to this URL that would show them the high-res 10 megabyte image that they could really zoom in on and see details of.
Okay.
Cool. I think we've
there
done
are
it that
ways
way
to get
too.
images.
I think web viewers work.
Sorry.
But yeah, go ahead.
Are you there? Yeah, I was going to say there's ways to get images out of FileMaker databases that are on the cloud. Like if you use the data API, you can actually pull individual images out one time, which if you're just trying to get it on your desktop or somewhere else, sometimes you can do it that way as well. So that's I think one of the new script steps that they have is to get the addresses, like the URLs, publicly available from. Actually, I think maybe it's a local local host one, but you can use it after that API. What?
So I could copy a picture from this S3 storage onto my own desktop.
Yeah, you can get it. You can get them out.
Okay. Interesting. Cool. Thanks. I'll relinquish the floor to others.
I did forget to mention that once you have an object in S3, you can do more things with it. There are different AWS services, and I had a demo. There's one called Recognition. So if I say I want to, detect faces in this picture, let me back all the entry, and I'll just reference it directly from S3. Then I get back some nicely, formatted JSON. Back from this. This is a machine learning service from Amazon, and there's a bunch of different ones like this, but this is just one example. It gives me back some kind of interesting data to look through. Kind of neat. There's an action to recognize celebrities, see if it picks up, but yeah, you got back Robin Williams with the match confidence percentage too. Yeah, that's an action in recognition, recognize celebrities. So kind of neat.
There's a few hundred other services that AWS offers as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, Mike, what was our count of services? Bill Heiser gives 1,862 was the latest.
Oh, I don't know, because it keeps going up too, right?
1,800 different services from AWS.
Like there was I think recognition was the first, and there was like detect text in here, which works kind of good, but now they've expanded on that with there's a whole different service, or a couple different services, Textract and some others that are more geared towards if you're trying to do some OCR or heavy stuff like that.
There's a couple other AI ones that are pretty cool, like Glue and SageMaker as well.
Mm-hmm.
a little bit more
Yeah.
data oriented and images. I was going to ask another question for Mike. I enjoyed the presentation. I thought it was awesome. Just wanted to know if you had used EC2 in order to test new server configurations. Like there's a client that I had that asked about being able to handle a large number of WebDirect logins, and one of the things that we discussed was you get over 100 or so connections, then you start looking at things like master worker configurations in order to handle all the sessions. So I wondered whether or not you had done anything like that with having multiple AWS servers running for the same WebDirect solution, and what your experiences with that were.
We do have a client that's running, I think he's got 4 or 5 worker machines attached to one master, and has some crazy amount of clients that I think last I heard it was like, around like 350 WebDirect clients attached, at one time.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been running okay with it.
Okay. What about the instance sizes for the masters versus the workers? Are you using matched instance sizes or using smaller ones for the workers? Or bigger ones for that
in
matter?
his case, he's got I think the master one, if I'm not mistaken, was an X large, and the workers were T3 large.
Okay.
So, and that hasn't, apparently that having the worker machine alleviates a lot of that on the if you were in a one machine configuration, you might want to scale that up and have the bigger, beefier machine. But that's where it's like, scaling out instead of up becomes an option.
Cool. If nobody else is gonna talk, I'll just say stuff. I've put a couple of people up on the AWS cloud as well. Some of the other reasons that my clients have moved up to the cloud are before Claris Connect, they wanted to attach some sort of a web API that needed to consume some data out of their FileMaker database. So instead of creating a networking thing, some sort of networking protocol at their on-prem server, they chose to go to the cloud. Or if they're looking to have a server that's in another region, so just something that's closer to where their office is, rigging up fast configurations to test new servers, new server configurations, and trying to figure out if we had more RAM, would it really make a difference, that kind of thing. Testing out new FileMaker server, like, hey, last time we changed from FileMaker server 15 to 16, all this stuff didn't work. Can we make sure that it's not going to fail when we go to 18 or 19? You can put up a server, put 18 or 19 on there, throw their solution on it. If it runs and they like the cloud, then you just leave that as their server. It's nice to have hardware backups. So one of the clients that I have on-premises server, it's like they're running a hard disk that's probably 8 or 9 years old, and I had to point out to the owner of that company at one point that if the hard drive failed, then they'd have to redo. So it'd take them a week to undo all the damage of it. So it's like, have a backup somewhere else, not just for the hardware, or not just for the data, but for the hardware. So it's kind of nice to have those. I have a couple of dormant servers that are just sitting there waiting to be turned on. Also for COVID-19, I've had a couple of clients that said, I don't want my server to be in my office. So put up something temporary. And for just for availability. So some of the clients I've had have had weak internet connections. So their upload or their download speeds, depending on where they are just not high enough in order for them to open up their on-premises server to the internet. So If somebody's working from home, it takes them 3 times longer to deal with all the images because the upload at their office is just not fast enough. So that can be knocked out by moving the server up to AWS. So it's a couple extra
Right.
reasons that people move.
I'll try and ask his, but he
Yeah.
wanted to know how much space you retain for the main EBS volume. Does it?
We start out with like a 20 gig for the databases to be on like separate from the OS. And then we kind of monitor that space. I think our general kind of thing is, once it starts getting below like 20%, that's available, look at bumping that up.
Okay. And then I know we've changed our thinking on this, but Paul asked, do you normally use a single volume for your cloud deployments or 3 volume setup, such as, C drive for the OS and D drive for the data, E for the backup, and, so what do we do about the multiple volumes? I know we've changed around on that.
Yeah, we have switched around on that. We started out with the 3 volume, right? One for OS, one for your databases, and one for backups. But since we've been going to this the Snapback strategy, we just have the 2 volumes. So there's one for the OS and one for all your FileMaker data.
And I think, weren't we having a problem early on where even though we were trying to separate things out, like things were getting put in the wrong place? And so it's just simpler just to put the data in with the program instead of separating it out?
Yeah,
Wasn't that one of the factors?
we've kind of gone through some of those configuration changes now. We're like, okay, do you install FileMaker Server on that second volume, or does that go on the OS volume? So for us, it's actually running on the OS volume, and we got it configured such that like you can't upload a file to that volume. It goes on the data volume.
Okay.
I have a question about that. Sorry, this is Sully again. The tech specs for FileMaker Server usually, at least the last one that I read, said that you should have 50 gigabytes of free space on your hard disk. So does that mean that you're putting 50 gigabytes of free space on the second drive and leaving the OS drive with 20 gigabytes?
I think that refers to like specifically on the operating system drive. I think that's what they're talking about.
Okay.
And I think that is in regards to like temporary data space free available for the operating system, like swap and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with Windows, you don't have like a dedicated swap volume. You have that swap on the C drive. So, and
Okay.
you'll see temp data go in and out.
Yeah.
So that's going to be dependent on the number of clients that you're supporting, as well as the size of the solutions. So if somebody's solution is bigger, we'll take that into consideration and up the OS volume size as well a little bit.
Yeah. So depending on how large the solution is, or how often and heavily that server is going to be used, you might change the size of the C drive then.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Okay. One other thing I wanted to ask you, the snapshots, when you're taking snapshots, the original snapshot, it doesn't snap the full drive. It just snaps what's being used, right? So like if you have 20 gigabytes of operating system stuff and other programs, and then another 20 megabytes of FileMaker, but you have a 500 gigabyte drive, you're only saving 40 gigabytes of it to start with, right?
Yeah. So in our configuration, it's a 20 gig data drive. So all your FileMaker stuff would be run on there. That's the one that we're snapshotting.
Yeah. Cool.
Paul asked, The FileMaker 19 is recommending 500 gigabytes, 100 with a minimum 100 gigabytes free space.
Yeah,
Do you have any thoughts on that? That seems.
we don't believe them.
I haven't.
Sounds excessive.
I haven't looked at that yet, so I didn't realize it was
Yeah.
that they bumped it up so high.
They said the same thing on the Linux preview too, and you can see like I've got a Linux preview running here, and I just use an 8 gig volume. I would not recommend this for production, but you know, you can see that with Linux and FileMaker Server and everything installed, it's only taken up, you know, 4 gig.
Tiny. Are you guys running most of your clients on Linux now that they've switched over, or have you still stuck with Windows?
Well, their Linux is still just in preview right now.
Yeah, it's beta
Yeah,
testing.
so but we're evaluating that.
Yeah.
But you know, honestly, it's like we've got to apply all the same kind of thinking to that. It's like snapshots and everything, but it does make it easy. You know, if we do need to build up a new server, you know, we've kind of got it scripted where, you know, it goes out and pulls in all the information that we need to build up a new server. And when I hit this button, we come back in about 20 minutes. We've got a fully configured FileMaker server out there for us.
Wow, it's fast.
Yeah.
Are you using CloudFormation to do any of the stack for you?
Not for this, actually. It's kind of a combination of FileMaker scripting, interacting with AWS and their some of their different APIs. Like we use SSM a lot to do a lot of our automations. Say I want the 19 server, just pick 19 and then deploy. There was a lot of scripting in this to, you know, have that kind of ready for us and automation that goes on. And it's a combination of like AWS scripting and PowerShell scripting.
Cool.
All right, we're just a couple minutes away from the half hour, so nobody else has any more questions. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Mike Duncan for presenting and showing us all this stuff about AWS and putting FileMaker in the cloud. And I'm planning on a meeting in 2 weeks, and hopefully I'll see everybody there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.